I still remember the day I first met Elaine Barnell, though nearly everyone in the neighborhood, myself included, calls her Karen behind her back. It was a muggy summer afternoon, the kind where the crickets and cicadas seem to tune into some incessant symphony, and you feel as though you're stepping through hot, heavy air just to walk outside. I'd been living in the neighborhood for a mere week, full of hope that the suburban life in this quiet corner of the United States would grant me both space and tranquility. Little did I know I was about to cross paths with the most notorious personality on Oakwood Crescent Drive, the self-appointed dictator of the Homeowners Association. Karen was in her late 40s or early 50s. No one was exactly sure, with impeccably styled shoulder-length hair and a wardrobe that looked as though it had never been touched by so much as a wrinkle. Her posture alone, the tilt of her chin, the rigid set of her shoulders, radiated an almost regal entitlement. She was the kind of person you could feel approaching, like a low atmospheric pressure system that promised a storm. And, like a storm, she arrived in a swirl of crisp perfume and judgment. When I first moved in, I had no idea that hanging laundry outside was anything of note. I'd grown up with the comforting sight of billowing sheets drying in the wind, the sun bleaching and freshening clothes in a way no chemical-laden dryer sheet could replicate. So, without a second thought, I strung a simple clothesline from the side of my garage to a post I'd driven into the patch of lawn behind my small rosebush garden. It looked picturesque to me. The best part was that the sun shone there for the entire afternoon, accelerating the drying process. I'd never felt anything was more natural or more right. Then Karen paid her first visit. She swooped in, stepping across my yard in pristine white flats that never seemed to pick up a speck of dust. She had this strange ability to walk on grass as though it was made of marble. It was as if even nature itself dared not sully her shoes. That day, I was on my porch, sipping a tall glass of iced lemonade while keeping an eye on my flapping t-shirts and jeans. She said nothing at first, simply studying my small setup with pursed lips and narrowed eyes. I could tell by her posture alone, upright and tense, that she was not pleased. "It's such a pity," she said finally, folding her arms across her chest in a posture that exuded disapproval. "I see you haven't had a chance to thoroughly review the Oakwood Crescent Homeowners Association guidelines. Clotheslines are not exactly encouraged here." I blinked, glanced at the innocuous line of damp garments swaying in the breeze, and tried to respond politely. "I'm sorry, I haven't had the time to go through all the paperwork yet. I didn't realize this was an issue. Is there a specific rule about laundry?" She pulled out a small, spiral-bound notebook from her handbag. It was embossed with the initials HOA in gold letters. Inside, she flipped to a tabbed section labeled Appearance. She cleared her throat dramatically, as if she were about to announce a Supreme Court ruling. Article 4, Section 9 of our HOA guidelines. Clotheslines or any other apparatus for the external drying of laundry shall be discouraged in areas visible to neighbors or from the street. Exceptions require board approval. It didn't escape me that the guidelines said discouraged rather than forbidden, but I figured there must be more to it. Perhaps in practice, everyone recognized it as more of a friendly preference than a hard and fast rule. I tried to reason with her. "Oh, that might mean we can find a compromise. My clothesline isn't visible from the street. There are hedges in front." She shot me a tight smile that was anything but friendly. "Visible from your neighbor's properties is also part of the rule. I'm sorry, but you might want to read the entire handbook to be sure. We don't want to upset the aesthetic of the neighborhood." What followed over the next week were multiple visits by Karen, always unannounced, always taking photographs of my harmless little clothesline. She would knock on my door, sometimes while I was in the middle of dinner, and demand I come out to discuss. The first few times, I tried to reason with her. "My mother always hung clothes outside," I explained. "It's more eco-friendly, it saves electricity, and I can't imagine how it's harming anyone." She'd simply smile that tight-lipped, forced grin. "I'm doing you a favor by warning you," she would say. "Better you remove it now than face potential fines from the HOA board. And, as the newly appointed secretary of the board, it's my responsibility to keep track of every potential violation." I was tempted to tell her that real neighborhoods, communities that care about each other, don't require these sorts of threats. But I held my tongue, thinking maybe this was just some initial friction. I didn't want to be labeled the troublemaker of Oakwood Crescent. After all, I was the newcomer, and Karen had been lording over this stretch of cul-de-sacs for more years than I'd been told. Best not to upset her any more than I already had. I might have followed her demands and given up entirely on my beloved clothesline if she hadn't shown up at the most inopportune moment one evening. I'd come home from work exhausted. My job wasn't the most glamorous. I was an administrative assistant at a local marketing firm, and that particular day had been hectic. Paper jams, missed calls, and last-minute coffee runs left me drained. As I opened my car door, I noticed Karen's white sedan was already parked in front of my house, hazard lights blinking in that frantic, annoying rhythm. She stood waiting on the sidewalk, notebook in hand, arms crossed over a crisp navy blazer. Sweat beaded on her brow despite the breezy temperature, and I remember thinking how odd it was that she insisted on wearing office-like attire even in her own neighborhood. She beckoned me over without so much as a greeting. "I've just sent an email to the board," she began in that clipped tone. "I have photographic evidence from earlier today that you left your clothes hanging past midday. That's unacceptable, and the neighbors are starting to complain." I forced a polite tone. "Which neighbors exactly? No one else has said anything to me, and I've greeted a few folks who seemed perfectly friendly." "People don't always voice their complaints directly," she replied, clearly implying she spoke on behalf of them. "If you continue disregarding HOA guidelines, we'll have to escalate the matter." "Escalate how?" I asked, though the exhaustion in my voice was obvious. She pressed her lips together, as though savoring the power she held. "I'll see to it that fines are issued. Possibly we'll have a hearing. And if you're uncooperative, we can pursue legal recourse. Don't forget, that's all in the contract you signed when you bought this property. Do you want to attract that kind of attention?" That was the moment. Something in me snapped, or maybe it awakened. A rebellious streak I'd kept firmly under wraps, out of a desire for peace, finally rose to the surface. I realized how petty it was for her to bully me over something so trivial, all while cloaking her hostility in the language of standards and rules. I also remembered that the guidelines said discouraged, not prohibited. That subtle difference in language was meaningful. I decided I wouldn't back down. I'd find a way around this petty tyranny. That night, while I was cooking dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Karen's meddling. I'd had run-ins with bossy, pretentious personalities before, but never in my own home environment. This was my sanctuary, the place I should feel at ease, not threatened or harassed. As I stirred the pasta sauce on the stove, I recalled a popular internet trend where people posted pictures of their outfits, calling it street style or outfit of the day. I'd even seen entire social media accounts dedicated to capturing clotheslines in quaint Mediterranean villages. Suddenly, the idea hit me like a burst of illumination. What if I turned my clothes-hanging routine into an online spectacle? I could photograph the clothes not just to flaunt them, but to create a whimsical, breezy narrative. A comedic spin, so to speak, on high fashion meets suburban clothesline. Then, if Karen tried to say it was an eyesore, I'd have a growing online community who found it beautiful, or at least entertaining. I knew I couldn't change Karen's mind by reason alone. I needed something that would turn the tables and give me confidence. So I made a plan. The next time I hung my laundry, I would snap pictures and upload them to a fresh social media account. I'd label it something like street fashion in the suburbs or breezy threads. It would be a personal project, and if I got a few followers, all the better. Over time, maybe it would develop into a playful commentary on suburban living, that sense of community rules overshadowing individual freedom. The more I pondered it, the more it felt perfect. That evening, I set up an Instagram account, the most visual-friendly platform I knew, and tinkered with the username. After a few tries, I landed on Breezy Style Crescent. I updated the bio to read, documenting the realest street fashion, fresh from the line, blowing in the wind, no filters needed. The next weekend brought bright sunshine and a soft breeze, ideal for drying clothes. I did my usual routine of sorting them by color, but this time, I arranged the items on my clothesline with artistic intent. Whites on one side, bright colors in the middle, and darker garments on the far end. I'd never realized that the clothes I hung daily could form a gradient of hues that might actually be photogenic. I positioned my phone at various angles, low shots capturing the sky behind the fluttering shirts, sideways shots that caught the rose bushes in the background. It was amusing to me, borderline ridiculous, but I found genuine joy in the process. Once satisfied, I posted the best shots to my brand new account. The post read, "Welcome to Breezy Style Crescent, where the wind is our runway and sunlight is our spotlight. Today's fashion lineup: crisp white tees, a few bold red dresses, and my favorite pair of bright green socks. Enjoy the show." I added a handful of hashtags: hashtag street fashion, hashtag clothesline, hashtag suburban life, hashtag breezy vibes. Then I set my phone aside, half expecting no one to care. But to my surprise, within an hour or two, I started seeing notifications of likes and even some comments from strangers. They wrote things like, "This is so creative. Reminds me of summers at my grandma's house. I love clothesline shots. There's something nostalgic and beautiful about them." It was heartening. I realized there was a hidden community out there, people who appreciated the simple pleasures of fresh laundry drying in the sun. Perhaps they were city dwellers longing for a touch of rural or suburban nostalgia. Or maybe they were fellow suburbanites living under similar restrictions. I would have been content with just a handful of supportive comments. But by the next day, the post had gathered a couple hundred likes, and even a few reshares from accounts that specialized in vintage or rural aesthetics. Meanwhile, the faint flicker of rebellious triumph grew in my chest. Karen might hate my clothesline, but there was an entire corner of the internet that found it charming. Of course, the honeymoon period didn't last long. Karen noticed immediately that I had no intention of removing my clothesline. If anything, I was doubling down. I started leaving them out a bit more often, especially on those afternoons when the sun was just perfect. The next time I saw Karen was at the mailbox by the curb. I was collecting the usual junk mail, flipping through coupons for local pizza shops, when she appeared, crossing the street as if on a mission. She didn't bother with greetings. "I see we still have an unapproved structure in your backyard," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "Need I remind you of the next steps?" I forced a smile that lacked all warmth. "It's not a permanent structure. It's a simple clothesline." She clicked her pen aggressively, as if it were a weapon. "Regardless, you've had ample time to comply with our guidelines. I'll be bringing this up at the next HOA board meeting." I nodded, adopting a calm tone. "That's fine. I'd like to attend that meeting, if you don't mind. I have some clarifications I'd like to make." The look in her eyes told me she was taken aback by my directness. Perhaps she expected me to be cowed by her threats. "Fine," she said stiffly. "It's an open meeting next Tuesday at 7. I hope you'll be prepared." What neither of us knew at that point was that my silly little Instagram experiment was about to gain traction, far more than I ever expected. By the time Tuesday rolled around, I'd posted 3 more photo sets to the Breezy Style Crescent account. Each new post garnered more engagement, and I soon hit 1,000 followers. Then 2,000. People commented from all over the world. "This is the ultimate vibe, especially with those colorful socks. I love how the wind seems to tell a story with each photo. Who needs fancy runways when the sky does all the lighting for you?" I shared glimpses of suburban life in the captions, how the air smelled of freshly cut grass, how the local birds perched on fence posts to watch me pin up my clothes, how the passing clouds sometimes cast the perfect shadows. The more I posted, the more I realized that this was, indeed, a form of art. It was a window into the authentic side of American suburbia, beyond the identical houses and manicured lawns. Still, Karen didn't know anything about the account. She only knew I was continuing to hang clothes outside. She likely assumed I was just stubborn, refusing to bend to her demands. It never crossed her mind that I was turning that small act of rebellion into an online celebration. Tuesday evening arrived, and I walked into the HOA board meeting with a folder of printed screenshots from my Instagram feed. I was armed with an arsenal of positive comments, each praising the aesthetic value of my so-called eyesore. A large rectangular table dominated the room, and the 5 board members sat behind it, Karen among them. She was dressed in a tailored navy suit jacket, always impeccably pressed, her expression neutral but her eyes gleaming with anticipation. I took a seat among a small audience of around 15 neighbors. The majority of them seemed more interested in budget allocations for the neighborhood park or the proposed repaving of our main street. But once the meeting got underway, Karen wasted no time addressing the clothesline issue. She cleared her throat loudly. "We have a complaint against Ms. Jones," she paused to glance at me, "regarding the prolonged display of laundry in public view. This contravenes Article 4, Section 9 of our guidelines, and repeated warnings have gone unheeded." The board's president, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Randall, looked to me. Ms. Jones, would you like to respond? I stood up, nerves fluttering in my stomach. My voice shook a little, but I steadied it. Thank you. Yes, I would. First, I'd like to note that the guidelines specify clotheslines are discouraged, but not strictly prohibited. Second, my clothesline is, for the most part, not visible from the street. It's only visible to immediate neighbors. Karen interjected, which is exactly our point. They can see it, and it's unsightly. I didn't let her interrupt me. I've spoken to some of my neighbors, and none have expressed direct concerns, beyond Karen. My gaze flickered to her before I continued. In fact, I've taken photographs of my line, and I've shared them on a public platform. The response from the broader community has been overwhelmingly positive. I slid copies of screenshots across the table. Each was a snapshot of my Instagram page with comments praising the aesthetic. The board members picked them up, scanning them curiously. Karen let out a sharp laugh of disbelief. What do we care about people on the internet? They don't live here and don't have to see the laundry every day. I smiled. But they do see it, only through photographs. What's interesting is that the rest of the world finds it charming, a celebration of sustainable living and the beauty of everyday items. Mr. Randall cleared his throat. Let's keep this orderly. Ms. Jones, you've made your point that the response is positive, but we also have to consider the bylaws. I nodded. I understand, and I'm not arguing to dismiss the bylaws entirely. However, I'd like to point out that there's no explicit penalty for using a clothesline. The wording says discouraged, which implies a recommendation, not an outright ban. Furthermore, no one else on my block has approached me with complaints. Karen's mouth set into a thin line. I told you, people are too polite to say it to your face, but they've certainly told me. The board's treasurer, a woman named Lucinda, glanced at Karen. Have we received any formal, written complaints besides yours, Elaine? Karen faltered. And not exactly, but... Lucinda turned back to me. So, Ms. Jones, are you saying you plan to continue using your clothesline? I took a breath. I'd like to continue, yes. If we need a compromise, I'm happy to consider placing it in a more discreet area or limiting the days I use it. But I truly believe it adds character and is more eco-friendly. Mr. Randall checked a copy of the bylaws. In that case, until we have a formal complaint from more than one neighbor, someone besides MS. Barnell, there's little we can do to enforce it. You may want to keep it minimal, though, to maintain harmony. Karen looked furious, but Mr. Randall gavelled the issue closed for the moment. There were other agenda items to address. My heart hammered with relief. I had essentially won this round. Outside, after the meeting wrapped up, a couple of neighbors who'd attended came up to me. One older gentleman, Mr. Paget, patted my shoulder. Don't let Elaine ruffle your feathers too much. She's been on a mission about clotheslines for years. She once tried to ban garden gnomes, too. Something about them being tacky. A woman named Harriet, who lived 3 houses down, offered a sympathetic smile. Most of us don't mind your clothesline. We're sorry it's come to this. Karen can be intense. She's just got this bug about the neighborhood looking a certain way. If you need any signatures or statements, let me know. I'll happily support you. I thanked them both, feeling a swell of warmth. Maybe this community was more neighborly than I'd assumed. Karen was just one overbearing presence, overshadowing the quieter goodwill of the rest. As I walked to my car, I could see Karen off by hers, glaring my way. Her entire posture was rigid with frustration. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. We both knew this was far from over. Despite Karen's hostility, my Instagram account continued to grow. People from across the globe seemed to love the bright, summery vibe of laundry swinging in the wind. I started getting messages from small eco-friendly clothing brands, asking if they could sponsor a post. One brand that made bamboo socks asked if I'd feature their products in a shot. I was stunned. I'd never imagined a simple act of defiance would turn into a side business. On weekends, I would pick a theme: pastel colors, stripes, polka dots. I experimented with different backdrops, sometimes the garden, sometimes the blue sky, sometimes the wooden fence. My phone's camera roll bulged with hundreds of photos of laundry in various stages of dryness. Often, I laughed at myself. If I told my mother that I'd become semi-internet famous for hanging clothes outside, she'd never believe me. But it was real. My follower count soared into the 5 digits. People would comment from places like Italy, the Philippines, Canada, and Brazil, talking about how nostalgic the images made them, how they missed the simpler routines of life. Some asked me for tips on how to properly hang clothes for best airflow. Others simply congratulated me for standing up to what they called suburban oppression. In an ironic twist, it was Karen, through her attempts at micromanagement, who had provided the impetus for this entire phenomenon. I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph each time I posted, imagining her seething at the sight of my still fluttering clothes. Karen, of course, did not remain idle. She began amassing what she claimed were official complaints from neighbors. She left letters in my mailbox, all typed with no signatures. They read, "Your laundry is bringing down the neighborhood's property values. We're tired of seeing your undergarments flying in the wind." I suspected these letters might be typed by Karen herself. The language felt stilted, and they all had the same formatting. I mentioned it to Harriet, who dismissed them with a wave of her hand. "None of us wrote them," she assured me. "Karen must be forging complaints." As if that weren't enough, Karen began taking pictures not just of my clothesline, but of me going about my daily business. I'd see her stepping out of her car with her phone in hand, zooming in as I pinned socks or t-shirts. I felt violated, but also strangely amused. I posted about it online, calling it suburban paparazzi. My followers found it hilarious and outrageous. Some joked I should sell postcards featuring Karen in the background, documenting her attempts at HOA tyranny. Not content with forging complaints, Karen started a whisper campaign around the neighborhood. She told people I was ignoring an explicit ban. She hinted that I was the type to neglect property upkeep. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Curtis, mentioned to me that Karen had told him I was turning the neighborhood into a slum. I was furious, but determined not to stoop to her level. Instead, I continued my online presence, occasionally addressing these rumors in a light-hearted manner. Today's post brought to you by the slum of Oakwood Crescent, featuring a crisp cotton bedsheet that definitely screams low property value. The comedic spin resonated with my audience. I found solidarity among those who had faced similar bullies in their own HOAs or landlords who restricted everything from doormats to flower pots. More and more, this simple social media project became a commentary on the tension between individuality and uniform suburban ideals. A few weeks later, I received a direct message from an account called The Suburban Chronicle, a local online magazine that covered community news, cultural events, and occasional human interest pieces. They wanted to interview me for a story on the quirky clothesline influencer. At first, I was hesitant. Did I really want this local recognition, especially when Karen might see it as a personal insult? But then I thought, why not? This could be an opportunity to dispel some of the negative rumors. I agreed to the interview. A young reporter named Bethany came to my home on a lovely Saturday afternoon. She was bubbly and enthusiastic, peppering me with questions about how the idea started, why I thought it resonated with so many people, and whether I worried about ongoing HOA disputes. Bethany admitted she'd tried to contact a few board members, including Karen, for comments. Only Karen responded, and apparently, she responded with a diatribe about maintaining community standards and protecting property values from visual blight. Bethany found it so over the top that she nearly laughed while reading it. The article was published a week later with the headline, "Breezy Style Crescent, When a Clothesline Becomes an Internet Phenomenon." In the piece, Bethany wrote about how I combined practicality and creativity, showcasing ordinary household items in extraordinary ways. She also briefly mentioned the HOA controversy and Karen's stance, but the overall tone was supportive of my perspective. The piece got shared around social media, and even more people found my Instagram account. My follower count jumped again. It felt surreal. I kept thinking, all this because I dared to hang my laundry outside. Karen's mortification. Not long after the article's release, I walked outside on a sunny Sunday, heading to my car to run errands. There, across the street, I spotted Karen in her driveway, rummaging through the trunk of her sedan. The moment she saw me, her face went red. She practically slammed her trunk shut, then walked over to me in swift, angry strides. "Do you have any idea the embarrassment you've caused me?" she hissed, eyes darting around as if checking whether anyone else was within earshot. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She glanced up and down the street. "This article, everyone is talking about it. As if I'm some villain, trying to hamper your creative expression." I couldn't help but smirk. "Karen, You brought this on yourself. You could have just let me quietly hang my clothes. Her face contorted. You're mocking me in front of the entire internet. People are calling me names, dictator, HOA queen, and worse. I've seen the comments. I shrugged. I never mentioned you by name, only by a certain moniker. You earned that nickname, not me. She sputtered in indignation. I won't stand for this. I've already talked to a lawyer about defamation. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. A lawyer? Karen, if you want to go that route, be my guest. You'd have to prove I'm lying about something. Everything I've posted is the truth. Photos of clothes, some commentary about an unnamed neighbor. Besides, you're the one forging complaints. Should I show those typed letters to an attorney? The color drained from her face for a moment. She opened her mouth as if to retort, but thought better of it. Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched back to her house. I watched her go, feeling more resigned than triumphant. This neighborhood drama was draining, but at least now I had some moral support. Confronting the board, one last time. One evening, shortly after that confrontation, I received a notice in my mailbox. This time an official one, with the HOA letterhead and everything. It stated there would be a vote to determine whether my clothesline constituted a nuisance under the broad nuisance clause of the bylaws. If the vote passed, I would be ordered to remove it or face escalating fines. I knew immediately that Karen had orchestrated this. She'd realized the explicit clothesline ban was too vague, so she was attempting to brand it a nuisance instead. I showed the notice to Harriet, who shook her head in disgust. She's desperate, Harriet said. I'll attend the vote and stand up for you. The date was set for the following Tuesday at the same meeting hall. Only this time, the atmosphere was different. Word had spread about my story, and a small crowd gathered, some out of curiosity, others to show support. Karen led the charge, speaking first. She rattled off reasons why a clothesline was detrimental. Unsightly appearance, lowered property values, possible hygiene concerns, though that one made no sense, and setting a bad precedent for the neighborhood. Then it was my turn to speak. I stood at the front of the room, meeting the gazes of neighbors who'd come to watch. I understand the importance of aesthetics in a neighborhood. None of us want an unkempt, neglected area. But this is about more than a clothesline. It's about whether we allow a single individual's opinion to override the rights of a homeowner to do something that is neither illegal nor explicitly forbidden. Hanging laundry outside is a time-tested tradition that conserves energy, reduces wear on clothes, and offers a simple, nostalgic beauty. I went on to explain that I had thousands of supporters online who admired the practice, and that I'd received not a single genuine complaint from neighbors besides Karen. If we let her define this as a nuisance, then what's next? She's already tried to ban garden gnomes and wanted to regulate the color of front doors. Where does it end? The room was silent for a moment. Then Harriet stood up from her seat in the audience. I, for one, don't mind the clothesline at all. I think it's charming. I'd like to say that I oppose this nuisance designation. Mr. Paget followed, raising his hand. Me too. I see no problem with it. One by one, other neighbors added their voices. Karen's expression darkened with each comment. Finally, the board called for a vote. The question was, should Ms. Jones's clothesline be classified as a nuisance? By a show of hands, the motion failed. Only Karen, and perhaps one other board member loyal to her, voted yes. The rest voted no. That was it. The meeting ended with me free to hang my laundry. Karen could only watch in stony silence, her meticulously sculpted hair practically quivering with rage, celebration, and moving forward. When I got home that night, I headed straight to the backyard and pinned a small selection of clothes on my line under the moonlight, purely out of victorious glee. The next morning, I took fresh photos at dawn, capturing the warm sunlight streaming through the cotton. I posted them with the caption, "Victory at sunrise. The clothesline stands, the breeze blows, and we continue onward." My followers loved it. I received congratulations from strangers I'd never met, who had followed the story through my updates. It felt surreal and joyous. Of course, Karen didn't stop being Karen. She still patrols the neighborhood, scanning each house for any sign of perceived violations. Sometimes she'll glare at me if our paths cross. But after losing that vote, she's had to swallow her pride. According to the bylaws, she can't unilaterally act without majority approval. For a while, rumors circulated that she was planning to move to a different neighborhood, one with stricter HOA rules. But as of now, she remains. Some days, I feel a twinge of pity for her. It must be exhausting trying to micromanage every detail of other people's lives. The best part, at least from a comedic standpoint, is that Karen's incessant attempts to get me to remove my laundry only drew more attention to it. Every time she made a fuss, I posted about it, and my account grew. People became invested in the saga, cheering every time I stood my ground. In a perverse way, she was my best promoter. I eventually started monetizing my posts. The small eco-friendly clothing brands that reached out became legitimate sponsors, sending me free samples of shirts, socks, and even hats to hang on my line. I'd photograph them in creative arrangements, sometimes pinned with clothespins shaped like butterflies, sometimes draped in a way that caught the wind just right. My living room began to overflow with gifted items. And so, what began as a simple act of defiance turned into a part-time gig that brought in a modest side income. The comedic irony was not lost on me. Karen wanted the clothesline gone because it was an eyesore. Instead, she turned it into a local and slightly broader phenomenon, ensuring that more people than ever were looking at it. Today, the clothesline still stands, swaying gently in the suburban breeze. Life has settled into a new routine. I work my day job, come home, and occasionally hang clothes to dry under the warm sun. On weekends, I set up themed photo shoots for my ever-growing Instagram audience. I interact with them in the comments, hearing stories from people in countries far away who find a sense of peace or nostalgia in my simple images. As for Karen, excuse me, Elaine Barnell, she still prowls about, always poised to pounce on the next violation. But the fervor has cooled. The HOA recognized that her vendetta was personal, not community-driven. She lost face in front of the neighbors when her plan to ban my line fell through. I suspect she's biding her time, waiting for a fresh opportunity to exert her authority. But I no longer worry about it. Hanging laundry outside was never just about laundry. It was about personal freedom, tradition, sustainability, and a small act of rebellion against petty tyranny. The irony that I became something of a mini-influencer in the process still makes me chuckle. If there's any lesson to glean from it all, it's that the simplest routines of life can, under the right circumstances, become art, and that sometimes the greatest way to triumph over meddling neighbors is to celebrate the very thing they despise. I'm certain that every time Karen walks past my fence and catches a glimpse of my shirts and jeans fluttering in the open air, she's reminded that her attempts to enforce her narrow vision of suburban perfection only ended up amplifying my voice. Now, she can't avoid the daily sight or the knowledge that the internet admires it far more than she ever could. And for me, the knowledge that I've upheld this small victory for individuality and creativity is more refreshing than any breeze that's ever blown through Oakwood Crescent.